my friends are simps.
A few weeks ago, one of my older albums was removed from Spotify after they claimed that they'd found what they called irregular streaming patterns. In other words, their assertion was that me or somebody else had been artificially inflating the listening count on a particular album, I guess ostensibly to fraudulently generate revenue. This all seemed quite bizarre, to be honest, because not only have I never used bots to jack up listening stats, I also don't really see the point. Infamously on Spotify, you need to have at least 1,000 listens per track over a period of 12 months before you're eligible for monetization. And even when you get to that point, the royalties per stream are so incredibly low that you really need to achieve astronomical listening figures to generate any kind of meaningful sums of cash. I am under no illusion that I will ever make any money off of the platform, and as an independent artist, the only reason that I use Spotify in the first place is to have a convenient centralized place for people like gig bookers, friends and other casual listeners to find and reference my music. If I can no longer reliably do that, then it calls into question why I would bother even putting my stuff on there in the first place. This tension with the current digital distribution model is one that I think lots of smaller musicians are increasingly grappling with, and it's something that I'm personally thinking a lot about as I gear up to release a new album. So I wanted to put together this video to talk a wee bit about my recent experience, think through some of the issues that are involved, and get your take in the comments on whether or not I should continue to release music on Spotify, as well as perhaps also hopefully encouraging you to switch over to something like Tidal or Apple Music instead. And this is not some thinly veiled attempt at engagement farming. I'm interested in this conversation. So you know what to do. For those of you that aren't aware, you can't just submit music directly to streaming services like Spotify. For that, you need to go through what's known as a digital distributor. Record labels and major artists naturally and fairly obviously have their own direct connections and mechanisms that they can use. But for the vast majority of us sad plebs, we've got to make do with consumer level partners like DistroKid and TuneCore. Now, none of these companies are particularly great. All of them have got their own, individual problems and idiosyncratic pricing models. And a few months back, I made a video detailing the crappy experience that I had with one of them in particular, Amuse.io. However, more recently, I had gravitated towards using a platform called CDBaby for distribution because they allow you to pay a single fixed price per release rather than being locked into, an expensive artist-specific annual subscription model. Generally speaking, CDBaby have been pretty good, at least in the sense that they've done what they said they would do. Well, kind of the bare minimum of what they said they would do, distributing releases to a variety of platforms. However, when the rubber has hit the road, I have to say that their customer service has turned out to be not just appalling, but completely non-existent. A few weeks back, I received an email from CDBaby telling me that Spotify had notified them about these so-called irregular streaming patterns and that as a result, one of my releases would be permanently removed from the platform. Now, this was the first time that I'd ever heard anything about this, and the email didn't even name the release that they were talking about, which was, let's say, unhelpful to say the least. As far as I could tell, all of my music was still available on Spotify, and there was no warnings or messages on my CDBaby account to indicate otherwise, so I didn't really know what the fuck was going on. On top of this, I wasn't very impressed with the language used in the email itself, because it very much implied that I was personally responsible for these alleged artificial streams, suggesting that I had perhaps employed some shady marketing services which had put me in this situation. In future, CDBaby said that I should keep better track of my artist account on Spotify to identify potentially problematic playlists, and that if the behaviour kept occurring, then my entire music catalogue could be at risk. What's more, they said that the severity of the infraction was so grotesquely bad that Spotify may elect to levy a penalty fee on them, which I would then be responsible for paying. Ironically, because Spotify don't and never will pay me any royalties, this fee would then come out of any money that I'd made from other streaming platforms, such as Apple Music, Tidal, etc. Naturally, I immediately replied to the email, which came from hello@cdbaby.com, not a no reply address, and I asked for more information. However, to date, Weeks later, I have yet to receive any response whatsoever. And about a week after I received the initial email, I discovered that my album, So You Made It to the Fire, had been removed completely from Spotify, prompting folks to ask what had happened to it. Since then, I followed up with CDBaby multiple times, using both direct emails and their contact form. I've also submitted a data subject access request under the GDPR to their privacy address, but I've received absolutely nothing in the way of a response. Zilch. Nothing. Fantastic service. Brilliant. Now, as I started to dig in and try and figure out what the fuck was going on here, I logged into my Spotify artist dashboard and discovered that there were 3 separate occasions over the past 9 months where the stream totals had spiked significantly, up to about 500 streams on each of those 3 days. Now, this is surely what led Spotify to flag my release. However, it proved to be incredibly difficult to find any other information. This is because the moment that your releases are removed from Spotify, you can no longer access segmented data about those releases in the artist dashboard. So in other words, I can't see any details about this album to identify what playlists or stream sources might have been at issue, or indeed to let me make a case to Spotify or the distributor to have the release reinstated. If, of course, they would even reply to my fucking emails in the first place. It is worth underlining that despite these spikes occurring over a fairly extended period and being relatively isolated, there were 3 distinct days at issue, I didn't receive any notice or any warning whatsoever from Spotify or CDBaby that something might be happening before the release was removed. It's pish, utter pish. As you might expect, I also contacted Spotify directly to ask them what the deal was, and they were also completely fucking useless. Spotify told me that they couldn't provide any information whatsoever about the allegedly fake streams, and that I needed to speak to CDBaby directly, even though Spotify themselves are the ones who had flagged the streams and required that the release come down in the first place. Given Spotify's refusal to engage with me, I decided to submit a data subject access request to privacy@spotify.com, asking for any information relating to my account and in particular any alleged infringements of their terms of service. Bizarrely, despite the fact that I had very specifically emailed the address listed on their privacy policy page, they then replied from support@spotify.com telling me that I hadn't contacted the right people and instead I should go back and use their contact form. Now, this is patently nonsense for a variety of legal reasons that I won't get into here, but when I pointed this out to Spotify, they then told me that whilst they would of course comply with the GDPR's requirements, they would not be providing any information about artificial streaming as part of a data subject access request, as it was out of scope. Now, I don't agree with that, and this is the subject of an ongoing dispute, which will take some time, and I expect I will inevitably have to make a complaint to the UK ICO. However, I'm not hopeful of receiving a satisfactory outcome. At this stage, it's much more about the principle as it is anything else. The bottom line is that this whole situation is just utter bullshit. The communication from both CDBaby and Spotify has been nothing but appalling, and they clearly just don't give a flying fuck about the artists that use their services. Whilst there clearly seems to be a few unusual spikes on the streams of one of my albums, Spotify should be able to detect these kinds of obviously fraudulent streams and take action against those who are generating them. You know, the spammers and the scammers and the fraudsters, as opposed to placing the blame on the individual artists themselves. It's a completely nonsense situation. Having my releases removed from distribution based on the nefarious actions of other people is patently unjust. And this is not an unusual or exceptional circumstance. In fact, it's a well-known problem. It happens to smaller artists all of the time. You just have to take a Google and see how many people are complaining about this. This situation, though, is especially insulting given that Spotify have gone out of their way to avoid paying anything to smaller artists, and the number of streams involved here are so low that they barely equate to anything at all. The sharp-eyed amongst you might also be questioning what exactly prevents Spotify from just reporting irregular streaming activity on independent artist accounts to then levy fees on distributors, which end up coming out of the revenue that those smaller artists have made from other platforms who do pay them. And to be honest, the answer to that appears to be absolutely fuck all. There is literally nothing that you can do to stop this happening. Now, there are many, many valid reasons to dislike Spotify outside of, just the contempt that they demonstrate for artists. One of the most obvious being that their billionaire CEO recently invested hundreds of millions of dollars into an AI weapons technology company. Speaking as somebody who quit a previous job because my employer was acquired by Lockheed Martin, this is a bridge too far, and so as a consumer, I've now completely ditched Spotify in favour of Tidal for listening to music because I don't want to pay them anything directly. However, when it comes to releasing music as a small independent artist, things are a wee bit more complicated, and I find myself fairly conflicted, to be honest. The unfortunate reality is that Spotify remains the largest online streaming platform, and rightly or wrongly, people expect your music to be available on there. If it isn't, then you risk losing what can seem like quite a significant amount of potential exposure. Most folks aren't going to do the legwork to Google your name and then download albums from Bandcamp. They want the convenience of a single familiar app with everything on it, as do gig reviewers and bookers, and to be honest, as do I. Because of this, ditching Spotify entirely can feel like quite a big deal. On the other hand, continuing to contribute and remain involved with a platform and business with such clear ethical problems also just doesn't feel right. Even if we remove all of the ethical and moral considerations from the equation, the truth is that it's becoming harder and harder for smaller artists like me to reliably manage their catalogues because of the actions of Spotify, combined with just how crap the digital distributors are. In many ways, it feels like there are incredibly diminishing returns, and it just isn't really worth the effort any longer. At this stage, I'm genuinely unsure what I'll do next. I'm fairly sure that I'll continue to distribute my music via other streaming services like Tidal, but I really don't want to use CDBaby again, though they are one of the only ones that has this kind of pay-per-release model, so I'm kind of in between a rock and a hard place. In addition to this, I'm seriously considering ditching Spotify for my future releases and perhaps also pulling my entire back catalogue from their service. I know that my albums and my music are but a drop in the ocean here, right? But part of the reason that Spotify is so popular is precisely because so much material is available in one place. And if we smaller artists start to pull out and reject the frankly shite treatment that we've been subjected to, then the value and convenience of the platform ultimately diminishes. Perhaps as musicians, it is time for us to reclaim some of our integrity, agency and autonomy, reducing and de-emphasizing the importance of platforms like Spotify in the way that we make, distribute and talk about music. We've all kind of been conditioned to feel like being on Spotify is some kind of validation, a necessary step that brings about a level of credibility and exposure that we simply can't do without, and that we'd lose the few listeners we actually have if we're no longer on there. But perhaps that's actually not the case at all. Maybe this has just become a kind of Stockholm Syndrome situation, and we just need to move on entirely, mentally. I would really genuinely like to hear what all of you think about all of this, especially as I'm gearing up to release this new album, because it will, it will help determine what I actually do going forward. So the questions that I've got for you are, should I ditch Spotify entirely or just not release anything new on their platform? For the artists out there, have you done this yet or been considering the same kind of move? Do you know any distributors that allow you to pay per release as opposed to, the DistroKid style subscription model, which I really don't like? And for those of you that use Spotify to listen to music, have you switched away from it to Tidal or something else? And if not, why not? In the meantime, the best place to find my music is over on Bandcamp. This has been the most reliable, even though it's not perfect, and it provides me the greatest amount of control and revenue. Specifically, it is the Cow Tongue Taco Records Bandcamp page, which is one that I run. It's got a whole bunch of music on there from artists that I've been involved with in different ways, the bands I've played in, my solo projects, etc, etc. And every purchase or listen from there is really appreciated and has the biggest kind of impact or return. So if you are interested, that's where to go. On the other hand, if you want to support the channel in a more regular, deliberate way, there's also Patreon, which has got access to all my music as well, including samples, etc, etc. Thank you for watching. Share your thoughts below, because I'm genuinely figuring out what I'm going to do next, and I need you to tell me what to do.